Imagine looking up at the sky right in the middle of July. You're expecting warm summer sunshine, right? But instead, you are greeted by this dark, eerie gloom and absolutely freezing temperatures. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unraveling one of the most bizarre and honestly terrifying anomalies in human history. We're talking about the global freeze of 1816. It was a year where the world was plunged into a completely unnatural winter, leaving millions bewildered, starving, and totally convinced that the end of the world had arrived.
To truly wrap your head around the horror of this event, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a farmer in July of 1816. You've just planted your crops, but out of nowhere, a violent snowstorm just buries your seeds. Across New England, Canada, parts of Europe, lakes and rivers that should have been bathwater warm were frozen solid. And in the middle of the day, the strange deep darkness just blanketed the land. It got so unnervingly cold that birds, unable to find food and literally freezing in midair, began dropping dead right out of the sky. The sensory contrast was just terrifying. People were wearing thick winter coats in August, huddling around fires, all asking one single desperate question: where on earth did the summer go?
Okay, let's dive into this, because the victims of this bizarre weather were frantically looking up at the dark clouds for answers, but they were looking in the wrong place. The bewilderment was absolute. They had absolutely no idea that the culprit wasn't in the sky above them at all. The true cause of this apocalyptic summer was entirely ground-based, and it was located thousands and thousands of miles away from those freezing farmers in North America and Europe. Section 1. Mount Tambora's Deadly Awakening. To find our culprit, we actually have to travel over to the lush island of Sumbawa in Indonesia. Here stood a massive, completely silent mountain known as Mount Tambora. For centuries, this sleeping giant just sat there, completely quiet. But then came April 10th, 1815. The mountain's centuries of suppressed rage finally broke. And that number you're looking at, that represents the sheer scale of what happened next. Mount Tambora unleashed the single most powerful volcanic explosion in the entire 10,000-year history of human civilization. The blast was of such a terrifying magnitude that the sound waves traveled unbelievable distances. It was heard a staggering 2,600 kilometers away. To put that into perspective for a second, when that deafening roar reached distant islands, British Army officers stationed far away were so convinced they were under attack by a massive fleet of pirates that they actually ordered their cannons to be prepped for battle. I mean, they couldn't even fathom that a sound that loud was coming from a mountain.
The localized destruction was, well, it was apocalyptic. The sky turned pitch black during the day, literally raining down fire, smoldering rocks, and ash. Tambora unleashed what scientists call pyroclastic flows. These are essentially rivers of superheated gas and rock traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour, burning at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The entire Tambora kingdom and the surrounding settlements instantly vaporized into ash. The victims didn't even have a single second to run. The blast also triggered massive tsunamis that totally drowned coastal villages. When the smoke finally cleared days later, the mountain's towering peak was entirely gone, completely replaced by a massive crater, a caldera that was 6 kilometers wide and a full kilometer deep.
Section 2. How gas froze the Earth. So how exactly does a fire-breathing mountain in Indonesia cause a snow-filled summer in Europe? Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is that it debunks a massive myth. When we think of volcanoes, we usually think of lava causing all the damage, right? But lava is highly localized. In the case of Mount Tambora, the global devastation was actually caused by what went up. Millions and millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas and fine ash blasted straight into the sky.
Let's walk through the science here. Based on data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the sheer raw force of the explosion shot this sulfur dioxide 50 kilometers straight up into the stratosphere. Up there, the air is highly stable, so things don't just fall back down quickly. The gas reacted with water vapor to form these microscopic sulfate aerosols. Essentially, these aerosols created a massive, invisible blanket over the Earth. But these weren't just any particles. They acted like billions of tiny, microscopic mirrors, reflecting the sun's warm radiation right back out into space before it could ever even hit the ground. This created a silent, invisible enemy that just spread across the globe, especially blanketing the northern hemisphere. One of the sources brilliantly describes this unstoppable phenomenon. They said it was like turning the world's AC on full power, but losing the remote. I mean, how spot on is that? The sun's rays were completely blocked, and the Earth's average temperature plummeted drastically. No one could see the aerosols, but trust me, absolutely everyone felt the brutal, freezing consequences.
Section 3. starvation, and global chaos.
That sudden drop in temperature completely broke human civilization because, as you know, a change in weather very quickly spirals into a fight for basic survival. The fallout in 1816 was absolute chaos. With freezing temperatures and snow falling in the summer, crops simply could not grow. This triggered the most brutal rule of economics: zero supply and massive demand. The prices of basic staples, things like rice and flour, just skyrocketed far beyond the reach of the everyday person. The result? Widespread riots. Across towns and villages in Europe and America, desperate, starving people began violently looting food warehouses. People were dying of hunger, the sudden cold, and new diseases. Daily life literally devolved into a violent struggle just to stay alive.
So the crucial point is understanding the sheer psychological terror of this era. Remember, we are talking about the 1800s here. There was no internet, no television, no telegraphs. A farmer in New England had absolutely no way of knowing a volcano had just erupted over in Indonesia. To them, the sky just suddenly went dark and summer never arrived. Rampant misinformation spread like wildfire. Many believed the sun had permanently died. Others called it doomsday, entirely convinced it was the apocalypse or some kind of divine punishment for their sins. The total lack of information amplified the terror tenfold. People would literally go to sleep at night not knowing if the sun would even bother to rise the next day.
Fortunately, the atmosphere's invisible mirrors weren't permanent. Very, very slowly, gravity did its job, pulling the volcanic ash and those sulfur particles back down to Earth. By 1817, slight improvements were felt, but the damage was so incredibly deep that it took real time to recover. It wasn't until around 1820, a full 5 years after the Great Blast, that the sun finally shone brightly again. The Earth thawed out and crops returned to normal. Section 4. The Threat to Modern Society.
Now that was over 200 years ago. But are we actually safe in our technologically advanced era? The terrifying reality is we might actually be even more vulnerable today, starting right up in our skies. Volcanic ash is an absolute killer for modern aviation. We got a tiny glimpse of this when British Airways Flight 009 flew into a much smaller volcanic ash cloud near Jakarta. All 4 of that 747's jet engines completely choked on the ash and failed mid-flight. If a Tambora-level event filled the global stratosphere with ash today, the entire global aviation industry would be instantly grounded.
And that is just the very first domino to fall. If global flights freeze, international trade totally stops. If crops fail like they did back in 1816, food shortages will cause global stock markets to completely crash, leaving millions unemployed in a matter of days. And while we have the internet today, that might actually make the panic much worse. Social media would act as a massive catalyst for fake news and hysteria, spreading fear much, much faster than the religious panic of 1816. We are deeply, deeply interconnected today, which makes a sudden global freeze a recipe for total societal gridlock.
And here is the chilling reality check I want to leave you with. Mount Tambora isn't dead. It is still officially classified as an active stratovolcano. It is simply resting, slowly gathering its strength, building pressure, and churning magma beneath the surface of the Earth once again. And this brilliantly illustrates what we're dealing with. Looking at the official data from the Global Volcanism Program cited by our source, we see the 1815 blast, followed by its last recorded minor eruption activity in 1967. But alarmingly, the source notes that deep beneath the Earth, increased seismicity has been detected right up to March 2026. The mountain is active. The pressure inside those ancient rocks is definitely building once more.
Humanity can build all the advanced technologies, supply chains, and complex economic plans we want, but ultimately, nature controls the timeline. When that boiling magma decides to cross the threshold again, we will be forced to face nature's cruel power all over again. The 1816 mystery is solved, but the mountain remains. Are we truly ready for the next year without a summer? Thank you so much.